After decades of high inflation, economic crisis and a stagnant economy, the new Argentinian president, Javier Milei, offers a radical plan: end inflation whatever the cost. He claims that with inflation soaring, Argentina has no choice but shock therapy. Liberalise markets, slash government spending, devalue the peso, close the central bank and eventually dollarise the economy. It's a libertarian dream, a bold and fascinating economic experiment. But will the short-term pain be worth the potential long-term gain? 100 years ago, Argentina was one of the world's richest economies. Its booming agriculture and export sectors encouraged immigration from Europe. French and Italians and British saw a great opportunity in Argentina. Living standards were similar to France and Canada. It was spoken in similar terms to the United States. Yet the devastating impact of the Great Depression and then frequent military coups started a process of decline, which means that 100 years later, the Argentinian economy, it seems doomed to flit from crisis to crisis. Argentina has received 22 bailouts from the IMF in the past 65 years. They've defaulted at least 5 times on debt and have one of the highest rates of inflation in the world. Something needs changing, but the question is what? There are many problems with the Argentinian economy. Firstly, it has strong trade unions and a generous welfare state, which in itself is not a bad thing, it can be very beneficial. But with a failing and weak economy, it struggles to meet the payments that workers have come to expect. Rather than slash spending, governments have resorted to printing money to pay wages. But this only creates more inflation and more instability in the economy. To try and keep a lid on inflation, Argentina has a complex system of subsidies and regulations and price controls. There was even a time when the government tried to control inflation by fiddling with inflation statistics. But the problem is, you just can't use price controls to solve inflation and the underlying problems. It just distorts economic activity, reducing investment. Now, interestingly, President Milei says that one of his economic heroes is actually Margaret Thatcher. Why? Well, in the 1980s, Thatcher introduced her own version of shock therapy. After a decade of high inflation and poor economic performance, she said she would bring inflation under control, whatever the cost. Interest rates went up, the money supply was cut, and government spending reduced. It caused a deep recession, 3 million unemployed, but it did bring inflation down, and after 2 or 3 years of economic pain, inflation was squeezed out of the system. Thatcher also sought to privatise inefficient state-owned industries. In 1981, 365 economists wrote to the Times saying Thatcher had gone too far. The government had imposed unnecessary economic pain. But Thatcher wasn't for turning, and she stuck with her unpopular policies. Ironically, she might have lost the next election if it hadn't been for the Falklands War, which boosted her popularity. But the problem is that it's not a fair comparison. Inflation in the UK in the early 1980s was nothing like the inflation Argentina has. Argentinian inflation is over 200%. It's spiralling upwards, and with a system of regulation and subsidies, it's often understated the real inflationary pressures in the past. To bring inflation under control would cause a deep recession, profound decline in living standards, and a major economic disruption. Secondly, Argentina has defaulted on debt so frequently, but it struggles to borrow in international markets. The government has no room for higher borrowing to help deal with workers with a decline in living standards that will come soon. In fact, government spending has been cut as part of shock therapy to reduce Argentina's reliance on debt and borrowing. Another problem of shock therapy is that it allows the peso to devalue, which has led to a 50% devaluation and significant rise in import prices, which adds to the inflationary problem. In the long term, this devaluation could increase exports, although the dollarisation of the economy would end that route as a source of increasing export demand. But the key thing is that in the short term, workers are going to see even higher inflation, falling economic growth, decline in living standards, and cuts to government spending. When you're struggling to afford food to feed your family, the promise of long-term economic gain may seem quite intangible. To sort out Argentina's inflation would require a couple of years of real economic pain. In the long term, lower debt and low inflation could have substantial benefits for the economy. It has the potential to encourage investment, innovation, and economic growth. High inflation does reduce growth rates, innovation, and living standards. Sometimes we do need to take a painful medicine to get rid of a disease. There are no pain-free ways to reduce inflation, especially in the case of a country like Argentina. But this particular medicine of shock therapy could cause widespread economic distress, at least in the short term. But even shock therapy and reducing inflation is no guarantee of success. One reason the Argentina economy struggles is institutional weaknesses. A history of military coups and debt default have made foreign investors wary of investing in Argentina. After the war, the Peronian governments tried to combat Argentina's extreme inequality by setting up powerful unions and a generous welfare state. But unlike, say, Western European economies, Argentina's economy was not strong enough to be able to afford these welfare payments. The government promised more than it could deliver, setting up a tendency towards higher budget deficits, bankruptcy and inflation. The tendency to economic crisis has also created political instability and a difficulty in introducing long-term economic reforms. To make a comparison to Thatcher, she had a large majority in Parliament, which gave her leeway to stick with unpopular policies in the short term. The other problem is that in the post-war period, Argentina imposed high tariffs on imports. They sought to protect domestic industries, reducing its international competitiveness. Now, Argentina actually has great natural resources. It has 21% of the world's known lithium reserves, which are very important for battery technology. It has fertile agricultural land, but has not benefited from these as much as it could. The old saying is there's no opportunity, but Argentina fails to miss. Long-term reforms need to be more than just reducing demand and reducing inflation. There needs to be a way to revitalise the economy, liberalise markets, encourage competition, and enable inward investment from abroad. Dollarisation is a radical solution to inflation. If you rely on the dollar and get rid of a central bank, which Mr. Milei calls the worst thing in the universe, you remove at a stroke the ability for governments to create inflation by printing money. The problem is that dollarisation only works if you can get enough dollars in the economy. The Economist is doubtful. It claims that Argentina would need at least $40 billion, but with Argentina on the verge of bankruptcy again, there's no dollars left to pay even the IMF, let alone to dollarise the economy. Secondly, dollarisation means you give up any independence over monetary policy and the exchange rate. And the concern is that Argentina will still find it very difficult to reduce government borrowing. But in a dollarised economy, there's no recourse to monetary policy and people could become destitute in the short term. Now, Daniel Reisbeck, a policy analyst at the libertarian Cato think tank, disagrees with The Economist. He claims that Argentina already has around 50% of the dollars that Argentina needs. There's already a strong black market in, say, used car sales and even real estate. Also, some like to point to Latin American countries like Ecuador and El Salvador, who have already dollarised their economy. Ecuador didn't have much reserves of dollars before it started. Initially, inflation jumped, but then inflation quickly came down as the economy got used to a dollarised economy. Now, economic growth in Ecuador has not been great. It's averaged around 1.1% in the past decade or so, slightly less than other Latin American countries. However, at least it has brought inflation under control. In Zimbabwe, dollarisation was introduced in 2009 as a way to tackle the hyperinflation plaguing the economy. And dollarisation was successful in reducing inflation. But it did lead to a period of low economic growth. Now, this very poor growth is not necessarily related to dollarisation. There's many other weaknesses in the economy. But it's important to remember that dollarisation is no panacea. It doesn't deal with the underlying structural issues in the economy. So, other examples of dollarisation, fairly weak in terms of economic growth, but it's worth bearing in mind countries who do dollarise tend to be struggling before they are kind of forced to do it because there's no real alternatives. Unfortunately, Argentina faces no easy trade-offs. Whatever policy they take, there's going to be very big economic costs. All this is completely different to my last video, where we looked at how Germany's economic problems were more due to choosing unnecessary austerity. You couldn't get a bigger contrast between the German and Argentinian economy. But do check out the video to see a very different kind of economic recession.